Hi, this is Ian Wright, and I'm just continuing a series of podcasts on specific learning, behavioural, and other difficulties that are affecting children, and how osteopathy could be possibly involved with those issues. It's an area I've been working with for a very long time, about over 25 years, and I've been teaching it actually for a long time as well. So it's an area I'm very familiar with, spend a lot of time with these children. And it takes a long time to discuss it. So one of the reasons why I'm doing these podcasts, actually one of the main reasons, is to explain what we're doing, what we're looking at, because it takes too long. And I want to, when I'm with people, I want to treat them and not be talking all the way through. So this is just a little insight. This one is about sensory processing disorder or sensory integration disorder. Which is quite common, quite often underdiagnosed issue. And it's very broad, and it has a lot of crossovers with other disorders and difficulties. And so it's often underdiagnosed. A lot of people call it sensory issues. So what it is actually is a problems with organizing and processing feelings of sensation or sensory feelings from the body or the external environment, for example, your eyes or your ears, or often it's to do with tactile feeling, how your body feels. It can affect one sense or often a few different senses. For example, you can have this, often children come to me present with a tactile sensory processing issue, but they often have an auditory one. For example, they can be too sensitive to something. In actually sensory processing issues, you can either be oversensitive to senses or undersensitive, and I'll talk about both of them. But actually, often you can be both. You can be both over and undersensitive in certain different cases. For example, if you're oversensitive, a child is oversensitive to touch, they can become overwhelmed by the feel of things. A good example of this actually is my daughter when she was young, when she was a tiny child from about 18 months onwards. She had this sensory over-awareness to certain things that she could feel. And, for example, she could not stand the ribbing inside the sock. So I would send off to America for these ribless socks because they would drive her crazy. Touching the feeling of her feet on the inner side of the sock would be just too much for her, and it would make her very agitated. So for about 2 years, I had to send off to America for socks for her. Interestingly, she grew out of that completely. She has no problems now. Now she's 15 years old. She has no problems with that at all. So it can be, and it's a very common thing with children, they can be overly sensitive to sound, to noise. In fact, her twin brother, when he was little, could not stand being in loud environments at all. He was very much oversensitive to sound, and we had to put earmuffs on him when he was little in certain situations because he found them absolutely overwhelming. So it's very common, some of these subtle things. It's when it becomes when there's actually a problem. It's when it's too much, when it causes problems with living a normal life of a child or an adult for that matter. A lot of these sensory processing issues, if they're minor, they do pass away as the brain tends to integrate a little bit more as they get older. It can minimalize, but there are a lot of adults with sensory processing issues as well. So if we're oversensitive, it's often auditory or tactile. Now, there can be a lack of responsiveness, where actually it can be tactile. So, you don't feel like you're knocking into things, and so you can have poor coordination because of this lack of feeling awareness. And there can be a lack of visual and auditory awareness, and actually it can be a combination of those factors. And those children can have an overall lack of responsiveness, and they can become impulsive or fidgety, or they can, for example, make very loud noises and not realize it. Now, this is where sensory processing issues are quite complex, because they cross over with other things. So some of this impulsiveness, fidgeting, can be part of a situation of ADHD. Poor coordination can be DCD, coordinational disorders. There's a huge link with sensory processing issues and ASD, autistic spectrum disorder issues, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all of those different issues in future podcasts, because it's a wide and complex subject, actually. But these sensory issues can be part, and are very commonly part of other issues with the brain. So it's just basically, when we're talking about sensory processing issues, it's one element of whatever could be going on with the child. So it's actually very rarely exclusively just a sensory processing issue. There can be other things that are involved with them. For example, dyslexia as well, or dyscalculus. So the difficulty is, I think, with regards to how the brain is wiring up in the time. And it can be a short-term thing, or it can be slightly more long-term. Sometimes you can have really strong sensory processing issues that just wane away as the higher centers of the brain get wired up. I mean, what happens is you get these senses, especially in terms of pain and temperature and touch, and they come up to a part of the midbrain called the thalamus, and then that switches up to the sensory cortex where all these sensations are being processed. And it could be processes it's like an electric circuit. And this electric circuit is getting wired up in a young child and in a baby, in a preterm baby. And a variety of causes can affect that wiring, and also they're myelinated, which means the fatty sheaths around the nerves are filling in, and you need high levels of fats, natural fats being processed by the body to create these myelin fatty sheaths, which are like superconductors, allow the electrical impulses to be conducted very effectively. Like, for example, in demyelinating disorders, multiple sclerosis, for example, is where the actual nerves aren't working as effectively. Now, that's just to show you what myelination is, which is to do with this fatty coverings. But what could cause these sensory processing disorders? Well, anything that can cause some of these other issues, ADHD, ASD, it's a very complex subject, and it can be connected to genetics, are definitely part of it. Certain genetic fields have certain genetic tendencies. Pregnancy issues in pregnancy, viruses, diabetes, placenta preeclampsias, how the nutrition of the mother is being processed. Very subtle things like this, how the nutrition is being processed, the gut function of a baby or a child is very important in how, for example, these fats are being processed. The birth itself. Birth trauma can lock everything up, and a lack of expression if their head goes through a lot of trauma in the birthing process, where they've got traumatic deliveries, and shock plays an important role in that, which I think I've talked about a lot of times. But as the brain wires up and these higher centers wires up, some of these issues can be overcome. And the wiring processing of the brain is very fine, and it can either overwire or underwire. And wiring is to do with as the brain synapses are formed, which are connections between different parts of the brain. They wire up by use. So the more we use these things, the more they are able to be used. Now, what causes these subtle changes in that, as I've said, is a variety of things. As osteopaths, what's our job here? I mean, our job is to free blocks. That's simply what we do, is we want movement expression. the central nervous system has this gentle breathing movement. We want that to be full and functioning as much as it can be. The cranial bones can be locked and wedged from birth processes, molding, birth trauma. Shock locks everything down. We want to free it up. In simple terms, the more free everything is, the more potential expression everything is. And what we try and do is be as precise as we can as to where isn't free in the body or in the nervous system or in the cranial bones or wherever it is in the body. If it's the gut function or whatever, we want to evaluate what bits aren't working fully. And if we can help them express themselves as best as they can, hopefully it can be helpful and it can minimize issues. I know that's a simple answer, but it's actually incredibly complex, all the different things you could possibly look for. And every child is different. Every child has their own, you could treat 25 children, all with sensory processing disorders, but they have different patterns that we need to treat. And that's what's beautiful actually about this kind of work, is you evaluate each child as to what is going on with them and treat accordingly. And everybody's different. And that's the lovely thing. And it actually makes it very interesting, fascinating, because every child that we treat is like our teacher, because we learn something new, because everybody's different and has their own journey. And the journey is one towards maximal expression. Anyway, that's an introduction to quite a complicated concept. We'll build on this and start talking about some of the other issues next time. Thank you.